never thought I'd see my son walk into a funeral in a suit that probably cost more than my first car. Especially not this funeral. And not after the way he left me. Years ago, when the bills piled up and the fridge was nearly empty, he decided poverty was contagious. He didn't just leave. He abandoned me like an old coat he'd outgrown. I learned to live without his voice, without his visits, without the hope that he'd come back. And then I met Richard, a man who loved me for who I was, not for what I could give. The day I buried him was supposed to be about grief, about saying goodbye to the man who had been my safe harbor. But when the church doors opened and Evan walked in, I knew this day was about to become something else entirely. I just didn't know yet that $16 million would be the reason. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint, almost medicinal smell of polished wood and old hymnals. I stood near the back of the church hall, greeting guests as they drifted in, their voices hushed, and their faces carefully arranged in sympathy. My black dress, plain and a little too loose at the shoulders, felt almost like a shield, thin but better than nothing. I'd shaken so many hands I could hardly feel my fingers. Richard's photograph sat at the front, framed in silver, his smile frozen in that warm, confident way that had always filled a room. People who had done business with him for decades murmured to each other about his generosity, his stubbornness, his vision for Caldwell construction. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the polished wood of the pews, and I'd remember I wasn't just his wife. I was now his widow. I had just poured coffee for one of his old golfing partners when the double doors creaked open. It wasn't the polite, discreet entrance of a late guest. The sound was louder, heavier, like a knock that dared you to look up. And everyone did. He stepped inside as though he owned the place. Charcoal suit, tailored to perfection, shoes so polished they caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. A gold Rolex flashed at his wrist as he adjusted his tie. For a moment I didn't breathe. "Is that her son?" someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. I thought they weren't speaking, another replied. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. The last time I'd seen my son. My only son. He'd been walking away from me with a duffel bag over his shoulder and resentment in his eyes. That had been years ago, and in the silence that followed, I'd learned to stop expecting the phone to ring. Now here he was, striding down the aisle like some visiting dignitary, scanning the crowd with that quick, assessing gaze I knew too well. Evan had always been able to read a room in seconds, and I could feel him doing it now, measuring who was worth his time, who might be useful. He stopped a few feet from me, and for a heartbeat we just looked at each other. The years hadn't dulled the sharp line of his jaw or that restless energy in his movements, but there was something else now. A smoothness, a practiced ease that made my skin prickle. "Mom," he said softly, leaning in just enough to brush his cheek against mine. His cologne was expensive and unfamiliar. "We need to talk. About everything. And about handling Richard's $16 million. The number hit me harder than the sound of his voice. $16 million. He'd said it like he was discussing the weather right here in front of God, Richard's friends, and the ghost of every promise he'd broken to me. I pulled back slightly, searching his face for some sign. Grief, regret, anything. But his eyes were steady, too steady, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his head. "Not here," I murmured, my voice tighter than I meant. He gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Later." We stood there in a small pocket of silence, while the murmurs swelled around us again. I could feel people watching, trying to piece together who this man was. To me, what history hung between us. My hands felt cold, despite the warmth of the room. Evan slid into the pew beside me, his posture relaxed as though this were any other family gathering. But I couldn't stop hearing that number in my head, 16 million. And the way he'd looked at me when he said it, as if it belonged to him already. The pastor cleared his throat at the pulpit, and the room quieted. I turned my eyes toward Richard's photograph, trying to focus on the man I'd loved, on the life we'd shared. but beside me I could feel the presence of my son like a shadow stretching across the aisle, and I knew the service was only the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. The sight of him sitting there stirred something raw and unfinished in me, a memory I'd tried to bury under years of silence. It was a night shift at the diner, the kind that stretched on forever, the smell of frying bacon clinging to my apron no matter how many times I washed it. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a pinkish hue over the chrome counter. Evan had come in close to midnight, pushing through the glass door with a force that made the bell jangle harshly. He slid into a booth without greeting me, his eyes sharp and restless. I grabbed a pot of coffee out of habit and poured him a cup, the steam curling between us. "I need $5,000, he said, skipping past small talk. I set the pot down and stared at him. For what a deal. House flipping. A buddy of mine found a place we can renovate and sell fast. We'll double the money in a couple months. His voice carried that urgent conviction of someone who thought speed equaled success. I wiped my hands on my apron. That's the emergency fund, Evan. If I lose my job or if I get sick. He cut me off with a scoff. You always think small. That's your problem. That's why Dad left. You're too afraid to take a risk. The words hit like a slap. He didn't even flinch when he said them, as if they'd been sitting on his tongue for years. My chest tightened, but I held my ground. I can't give you that money. I won't. His jaw clenched. Then don't come crying to me when you're still here working the graveyard shift at 50. He tossed back the coffee like it was a shot and slid out of the booth. I watched him leave, the bell above the door chiming again, softer this time. I told myself he'd cool off. I told myself he'd come back. But when my shift ended and I drove home through the empty streets, something felt wrong. The front door wasn't locked. Inside, the small metal cash box I kept in the pantry was sitting open on the counter, empty. My knees gave out right there on the kitchen floor. Next to the box was a single sheet of paper ripped from a notebook. His handwriting was quick and uneven. I can't live like this. You stay in this dead-end town. I'll make something of myself. The words blurred as the tears came hot and unrelenting. I pressed the paper to my chest as if holding it close could make it hurt less. It didn't. The apartment felt colder than I remembered, and the silence was thick, final. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the empty box in front of me like proof that what I'd feared most had already happened. I had lost my son, not to death, but to a life he wanted more than he wanted me. Even now, years later, sitting in that church beside him, I could still feel the sting of that night, the way my world had shifted. He was smiling faintly now, as if none of it had ever happened, as if we'd only been apart for a season, not a lifetime. And I realized with a heaviness in my chest that he probably hadn't come back for me at all. Back then, my life shrank to the size of a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat on the south side of Modesto. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, and the kitchen window looked straight into the brick wall of the building next door. Rent was manageable. Barely. Until the letter arrived, slipped under my door in a plain white envelope. It was from Mr. Ramirez, my landlord. A typed notice told me rent would be going up by $150 a month, starting next cycle. At the bottom, in his own scrawl, he'd added, "If you can't keep up, I'll need to find another tenant." My hands trembled as I read it. I was already stretching every paycheck from the diner. Another $150 might as well have been $1,000. The next morning, I put on my best blouse, cream-colored, the one without stains, and went to First Central Bank downtown. The air inside was cold enough to make my eyes water, and the receptionist's smile didn't reach her eyes. I sat across from a loan officer named Linda, who tapped numbers into her computer without looking at me. "Your income's too inconsistent," she said, finally swiveling the monitor toward me as if I needed proof. "We can't approve this request." "I'm sorry." The walk back to my car felt longer than it was. Every step echoed the same thought: there was no safety net anymore. Not for me. My neighbors in the building meant well, Mrs. Chen from down the hall brought me leftover dumplings sometimes. A retired couple upstairs offered to help carry my groceries, but pity clung to their kindness. In the grocery store, I'd overhear my name followed by murmurs. Her son left town years ago. Never comes to visit. It was a small town and people talked. That day I was in the produce aisle comparing the price of apples when I saw him. Evan. He was at the far end of the aisle laughing with a group of men in crisp button-downs and women with perfect hair, their carts piled with wine and imported cheese. He saw me. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and then he turned back to his conversation as if I were a stranger. I stood frozen, the cold mist from the produce case clinging to my arms. He walked past without a word, the group trailing behind him like a parade I hadn't been invited to join. I realized in that moment that whatever life he had now, I was no longer part of it. I buried myself in work after that. Double shifts, extra tables, anything to keep the lights on. The diner was my anchor, the one place where I knew the rules and could keep my head above water. But even anchors rust. One Tuesday evening, halfway through the dinner rush, the manager called the staff together by the counter. "I've sold the place," he said, smiling like it was good news. "New owners are coming in next month. They're bringing in their own crew." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the linoleum. I'd just lost the one thing keeping me steady. The chatter of customers went on around us, plates clinking, coffee being poured, as if my entire world hadn't just tipped sideways. I drove home that night in silence, the neon glow of the diner shrinking in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. 2 nights later, I was back behind the counter, filling sugar dispensers, and trying not to think about how many shifts I had left. The dinner crowd had thinned, just a few regulars tucked into booths, the low hum of conversation mingling with the clink of silverware. That's when he walked in. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair more silver than gray and the kind of presence that made you straighten up without knowing why. I recognized him instantly. Richard Caldwell. He'd been in before, always polite, always alone. A man people in town talked about in low, respectful tones. Retired president of Caldwell Construction, the kind of company that built more than just houses. They built neighborhoods. "Evening, Maggie," he said, like we'd known each other longer than a handful of brief exchanges. "How's the week treating you?" I gave a small shrug. "Could be better. You want your usual, please, and maybe a slice of that pie before it's gone." I poured his coffee, the good kind we reserved for regulars who noticed such things, and slid it across the counter. He took a sip, then studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether to speak. "I heard about the sale," he said quietly. "This place won't be the same without you here." His words caught me off guard. Most people barely noticed when someone like me disappeared from their routine. I tried to smile. "Guess I'll have to figure out my next move." He nodded, and for a moment the air between us shifted. "I know what it's like," he said, "to lose something that feels like part of you. I lost my wife Laura to cancer. Took me years to walk into a place like this without feeling her absence in the empty seat." I swallowed hard. There was no pity in his tone, just an understanding that came from having stood on the same cliff edge. "I lost my son," I admitted before I could stop myself. "Not to death, but to choices. His and mine." We didn't speak for a while after that. I refilled his coffee. He worked his way through the pie, and the silence felt comfortable. When he left, he placed a 20 under his plate for a $7 check. "For the coffee," he said with a wink before heading out. After that night, he came in more often. Sometimes he'd bring a bag of ground coffee from a roaster in Sacramento, saying it put the diner's blend to shame. Sometimes he'd sit for an hour reading the paper, asking me how I was holding up. I found myself looking forward to those evenings, the easy way he filled the quiet without smothering it. The more we talked, the more pieces of my guarded self slipped back into place. One night, as I poured his second cup, he reached across the counter and lightly touched my hand. His voice was steady but warm. "Maggie, you deserve to be loved without conditions." The words settled over me like a blanket I didn't know I'd been cold without. From then on, our evenings weren't just about coffee and pie. Richard started inviting me to meet him outside the diner, easing me into a world I hadn't stepped into in years. We'd walk along the Kern River Park trails in the early evenings, the light spilling gold over the water, his stride steady beside mine. He'd point out the old sycamores, telling me which ones had survived decades of storms, and somehow it felt like he was talking about more than just trees. One Saturday, he took me to a little place in Napa Valley, the kind of restaurant where they brought fresh bread still warm from the oven and set it down like a gift. Over dinner, he told me about Caldwell Builders, not just the buildings but the people. It's more than brick and mortar, he said. It's families, it's futures. His dream now, he told me, was to create a scholarship fund in Laura's name to help kids who'd never otherwise afford college. I found myself telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone in years, about raising Evan alone, the long hours at the diner, the birthdays I spent working because I couldn't afford a day off. He listened without interruption. His expression never pitying, only respectful, like my story was worth hearing. The way he looked at me made it hard to cling to the belief that good men didn't exist. I tried to tell myself to be cautious, but with Richard, caution felt unnecessary. One quiet Tuesday, he came into the diner just before closing. The place was empty except for us. He sat at his usual counter seat, hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Maggie," he said, and my name in his voice felt like an invitation. "I've been thinking, I don't want to spend another day without knowing you'll be there when I come home." I blinked at him. "Are you?" He smiled that steady, sure smile. "Marry me. No big show, no fuss. Just you and me making it official." My throat tightened. "Richard, I don't have—" He shook his head before I could finish. "Don't even say it. I'm not asking you to sign anything. No prenup, no conditions, just a promise to keep showing up for each other." The air between us was warm with the smell of coffee and something sweeter I couldn't name. I said yes before I'd even realized the word had left my mouth. 2 weeks later, I packed the last of my things into a cardboard box, handed my diner apron to the new owner, and locked my apartment door for the last time. Richard's truck was waiting outside, and when we drove up the long driveway to his 5-acre estate, the setting sun lit the house in gold. It wasn't just a home. It was a whole new chapter waiting for me to step inside. Life at the Caldwell estate unfolded like something I'd only read about in magazines left behind at the diner. Mornings started with coffee on the wide porch, the view stretching over rolling hills. Afternoons were often spent in the garden Laura had planted years ago, rows of roses, lavender, and climbing vines that seemed to have their own stories to tell. Richard showed me how to care for the place, guiding me through the greenhouse where Laura's orchids still bloomed. "She used to say a garden's just another way to leave something behind," he told me one morning, pressing a small trowel into my hand. I learned to navigate a different kind of schedule. Charity luncheons, community board meetings, evenings at the local art center. I wasn't just Richard's wife. I was part of the Caldwell legacy now, and people treated me with a warmth I hadn't known before. Still, every now and then, when a stranger asked if I had children, there was a hitch in my chest before I answered. One crisp autumn evening, we attended a fundraiser at the country club. The room shimmered with chandeliers, soft music, and the scent of expensive perfume. I was making small talk with a couple from San Luis Obispo when a man in a navy blazer, one of Richard's longtime business acquaintances, leaned in and said casually, "You know, I heard your boy's been having a rough time down in Los Angeles. Word is, he's deep in debt." The clink of glasses and laughter around us seemed to fade for a second. I forced a polite smile. "I wouldn't know. We haven't spoken in years." The man gave a half nod, the kind people give when they realize they've wandered into delicate territory, and changed the subject. But the words stuck like a burr under my skin. That night as we drove home, I found myself staring out the passenger window, wondering if it could be true. Richard noticed. "You've been quiet," he said. "Someone mentioned Evan," I admitted. "Said he might be in trouble." Richard kept his eyes on the road. "Maggie, some people only come back when they want something. If that's the case, you need to think about what you're willing to let back into your life. I nodded, but inside I was trying to push the thought away. Evan had made his choice years ago. I told myself he was gone for good and that I was better off not knowing. The estate was quiet when we returned, the moonlight spilling over the garden. I walked through the roses, inhaling their sweet, heavy scent, and tried to let the night air clear my mind. By the time I went inside, I'd convinced myself I could let it go. Evan was part of another life, one I'd left behind. It was a Tuesday morning when everything shifted again. Richard was in his favorite chair by the bay window, the newspaper folded neatly in his lap, a mug of coffee cooling on the side table. I was in the kitchen rinsing blueberries when I heard the sound, soft at first, then a sharp thud like a book hitting the floor. Richard! My voice caught as I hurried into the living room. He was slumped forward, the paper sliding from his hands, his eyes half closed but moving as if he were chasing something in a dream. I called 911, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The operator's voice was calm, instructing me to keep him still to check his breathing. Within minutes, the paramedics were at the door, their brisk, efficient movements filling the room. The ride to the hospital felt endless. The steady beep of the heart monitor in the ambulance was the only thing keeping me from unraveling completely. Dr. Susan Patel met me in the ER hallway. She was young but carried herself with the kind of authority that made you want to believe her. "It's a stroke," she said. "We've stabilized him, but you should be prepared. He may experience partial memory loss, confusion, or difficulty with speech." The words hit me like cold water. Will he recover? It's too early to tell. The first weeks are crucial. He'll need rest, consistency, and familiar surroundings. I arranged for him to come home under the care of a private nurse, Claire Thompson, a woman in her 40s with calm blue eyes and a no-nonsense way of speaking. She moved into the guest house, setting up a schedule of medications, therapy sessions, and gentle walks around the garden. Some days Richard was himself, asking about the weather, commenting on the state of the roses, even teasing Claire about her strong coffee. Other days, his gaze would drift and he'd call me Laura without realizing it. I learned to answer gently, not to correct him too harshly. Late one evening after Claire had gone to bed, I sat beside him in the dim light of the living room. He was half asleep, his breathing slow and uneven. I reached over to adjust the blanket when his fingers twitched and his lips moved. "Don't trust," he murmured, the words barely audible. I leaned closer. "Richard, what do you mean?" But his eyes had already closed again, his hand relaxing into mine. The moment slipped away, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the clock on the mantel and a knot forming deep in my chest. It was 2 weeks later when the front gates buzzed unexpectedly on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Claire was in the garden with Richard and I was sorting through a pile of medical bills when the intercom crackled. "Mom." The voice on the other end froze me in place. I walked to the gate camera, and there he was. Evan, dressed in a tailored navy suit, hair slicked back, grinning like no time had passed at all. He hugged me the moment I opened the door, the smell of expensive cologne washing over me. "I've missed you," he said, pulling back just enough to study my face. "I'm doing really well now. Real estate's been good to me." Before I could respond, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a crisp envelope. "This is for you. $60,000. Just sitting there for my mom in case you need it." I took the bank statement he slid across the foyer table, my fingers tightening around the paper. The numbers were real enough, but a voice in my head whispered caution. That evening, I made dinner. Roast chicken, Richard's favorite. And Evan insisted on setting the table. He sat across from me, chatting about property deals in Santa Monica and a big project coming up in Palm Springs. Halfway through the meal, he leaned back casually and asked, "So, how's Harold doing these days?" "Still your lawyer." His fork hovered over his plate, his eyes locking onto mine with a glint I hadn't seen since he was a teenager testing boundaries. I imagine he's handling Richard's will. I felt my stomach tighten. "Harold's fine. We haven't discussed anything like that recently." Evan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good to know. He went back to cutting his chicken, but I caught the flicker of something sharper. Something that didn't belong in a family dinner. Over the next few days, Evan settled into the guest room and made a point of spending time with Richard. He read to him in the afternoons, wheeled him into the garden, even learned how to brew Richard's favorite coffee. Claire commented more than once on how attentive he seemed. And yet every time I caught Evan watching Richard, it was never quite the same as when he looked at me. There was calculation there, quiet and quick, like a man measuring a space before making an offer. By the end of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that his return wasn't only about making amends. The house was finally still after the last of the funeral guests had gone. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint trace of cigar smoke some of Richard's old friends had left behind on the porch. I was gathering half-empty glasses from the living room when a voice drifted down the hallway, low, deliberate, and impossible to mistake. I followed it to the study door, which was cracked just enough to see Evan standing near Richard's old desk, his phone pressed to his ear. Yeah, he was saying, "I'll make sure I get my share of the $16 million. Harold can spin it however he wants, but I've got someone on Richard's side of the family backing me up. Legal's already in motion." I froze, my fingers tightening around the tray. Masekis. The warmth I'd been trying to hold on to since his return drained away in a rush of cold. When he hung up, I pushed the door open. 16 million, Evan. My voice was sharper than I intended. Is that why you're here? He didn't flinch. I have a right to it. Richard was my stepfather, and I've been advised that as his stepson, I can contest the will if I'm left out. You haven't been part of this family in years. I said the words trembling with equal parts anger and hurt. His expression hardened. That doesn't erase my legal standing. And if you think you can cut me out, you're wrong. I'll take it to court before I let that happen. For a moment, the air between us was heavy enough to crush the rest of the words I wanted to say. That was when Harold stepped into the doorway, his calm presence carrying the weight of someone who'd been listening longer than I had. Evan, he said evenly, this isn't the time or the place. Leave the house tonight. We'll see you at the reading of the will. Evan's jaw tightened, but he grabbed his coat from the chair without another word. As he walked past me, his shoulder brushed mine. Not by accident, and he gave me a look that made it clear this wasn't over. The next afternoon, I sat in Harold Green's office, the leather chair cool beneath my hands. Across the table, Evan lounged back in his seat, a sharp-suited attorney beside him. He looked smug, as if this meeting was just a formality before he claimed what he believed was his. Harold adjusted his glasses and opened a folder. Before we begin, he said, I need to inform you both of a codicil Richard signed 2 days before his passing. His voice was calm, but the room seemed to hold its breath. This amendment to the will explicitly states that Evan Turner is to receive no part of the estate. Evan laughed short and disbelieving. You can't do that. I'm his stepson. I can contest. Harold held up a hand. You can try. But per Richard's instructions, if any part of the $16 million inheritance is contested, the disputed amount will be transferred immediately to the Caldwell Scholarship Fund. Nothing to you, nothing to Maggie. Evan's attorney shifted uncomfortably. That's unusual. It's airtight, Harold replied. Richard was thorough. Then he slid a printed email across the table toward Evan's lawyer. This, however, makes the codicil even more justified. I didn't have to read it again. I'd seen it last night. Evan's own words sent to a friend boasting about how he would play the caring son long enough to get control of Richard's assets. Evan's lawyer scanned the page, his lips tightening. Evan, I can't represent you in this matter, he said, quietly closing his briefcase. Good day. Without another glance, he left the room. Evan's smugness drained in an instant. So that's it. You set me up, you and Harold. This is betrayal. I'm your son, your blood. I met his eyes, feeling the weight of years pressing between us. You made your own choices, Evan. For a moment, he looked as if he might say more, but the words died in his throat. The only sound was the faint ticking of Harold's wall clock, marking the slow collapse of his plans. 3 months later, I stood at the podium in the modest auditorium of Bakersfield Community College. The stage smelled faintly of varnish and fresh flowers. Behind me, a banner read, Caldwell Scholarship Award Ceremony. I looked out at the rows of students, their faces bright with anticipation. 15 recipients this year. 15 young people stepping into the future with less weight on their shoulders. Richard would have loved this. I called each name, shaking hands, offering envelopes. When I reached Bella Moore, a slight young woman with calloused hands and a shy smile, she clutched the certificate like it was a lifeline. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've been working nights at the hardware store since I was 16. My mom's sick, and this means I can actually finish school." Her voice wavered, and for a moment I saw my younger self scraping by, wishing someone would believe in me. My chest tightened, and I placed my hand over hers. "Make the most of it, Bella. You deserve it." The ceremony ended with polite applause, but the real reward came in the quiet conversations afterward. Students telling me about their dreams, parents thanking me for giving their children a chance. Later in the courtyard, an old friend from the diner days approached me. "Maggie, I heard something about Evan," she began cautiously. I braced myself. "He's in trouble," she said. "One of his big developments in Los Angeles collapsed financially. Investors are suing. Word is he's going to lose everything." I felt no jolt of triumph, no sting of vindication, just a deep, steady calm. I nodded, eyes drifting toward the evening sky. Some things, I thought, don't need my hand to set right. A few weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself turning onto the old stretch of road that led to Route 99 Diner. The red paint on the sign had faded and the parking lot was half full, but the familiar scent of coffee and grilled onions met me the moment I stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Tom Reynolds, the diner's former owner, now helping out part-time. He spotted me instantly. "Well, look who's here," he said with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you in ages." We sat in my old booth, the one near the window. The vinyl was cracked now, but sunlight still streamed through just the same. Tom poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. "You've had quite a journey," he said, leaning back. "Heard about the scholarship fund. Richard would be proud." I stirred cream into my cup, watching the swirl dissolve. "It's been a long road," I admitted. "Some of it I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I got here, and I'm still standing." We talked about the early days. My double shifts, the regulars who used to tip in quarters, the nights when the diner felt like my only anchor. It felt good to remember without the ache. As the afternoon light softened, I paid the check and promised to stop by again. I climbed into Richard's old pickup, the bench seat worn smooth by years of use, and drove home along the back roads lined with golden fields. At the house, I kicked off my boots and headed straight to the garden. The roses I'd planted in Richard's honor were in full bloom, their scent drifting in the cool air. I knelt to pull a few weeds, my fingers sinking into the earth, and felt the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Inside, I paused in the living room. On the mantel sat a photo of Richard and Laura taken years before I knew them. Laura's smile was soft, his arm around her shoulders. I touched the frame gently, a silent promise that I'd cared for what he loved. I thought about the people who had come and gone, about the son who had once been my whole world and had chosen another path. His absence was no longer a wound, just space I'd learned to live with. Loss had shaped me, but so had kindness. And in that balance I'd found something stronger than revenge, peace. The best revenge, I realized, is living a life where the absence of the betrayer is a gift, not a gap. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have fought, walked away, or simply built a new life like I did? I'd love to hear your thoughts.